Hey guys, today we're going to talk about one of the fastest growing cyber attacks in Microsoft 365. It's actually grown over 111% year over year. And I'm going to be giving you guys the 4 top recommended policies that I would implement in your Microsoft 365 environment to help protect and mitigate these attacks. My name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been creating content here in the channel for the better half of the decade. If you want to see more videos like this around cybersecurity and Microsoft, be sure to subscribe. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay guys, so getting into it here, the attack I'm going to be talking about with you today is called token theft. It's also known as a token replay attack. As I mentioned, it's growing wildly in popularity and volume of cases that we're seeing with user compromise behind this. And it's actually extremely scary because this is where a user can get compromised even if they have multi-factor authentication enabled on their account. So in this video, we're going to go through 3 major key elements here, which is number 1, how it works. So you understand what defenses you might want to put up to help prevent against it. What's the risk to your business? And what does it mean if a user gets compromised with this method? And then how to prevent it. And that's where I'll get into some of my recommended remediation tactics, policies, and settings that you can configure within your Microsoft 365 environment. I'll also be covering the licensing considerations there too, just so you understand that of where you exist today. One of the fundamental aspects, though, that we have to understand is really just the importance of tokens and how they're issued. And so I'm going to be using this example with the Empire as our corporation, the Star Wars example here, to kind of give you something that's relatable here that you can use to help generate these concepts and consume them. But fundamentally here, when we talk about getting a token and how it's used to get access into our corporate resources, whenever you sign in to something like Microsoft 365, you're providing credentials to prove your identity. That's stored in Microsoft 365. So that today might be a username and password and an MFA grant that you would have. Some of us are still using legacy methods of MFA like SMS or an email. Others of us are using more advanced methods like Microsoft Authenticator to get a number matching concept to avoid things like MFA fatigue attacks. And some of us, even above that, are starting to use what's known as phishing resistant methods of MFA to bypass certain phishing attacks. And that's going to be going beyond the scope of this video. Just want to call that out though. In this case though, as we look at our Star Wars example, we can think about a stormtrooper kind of reporting for duty, if you will, and validating their identity with the Empire, and the Empire really giving them kind of like a key card or an access badge, something like that. And in the Microsoft realm, this is kind of known as a session token. And so whenever we get this session token, we can use it to go ahead and get access into corporate resources. And so on the Microsoft side, that might be like our email, it might be our documents in SharePoint, it might be our Teams chats. And in this case with the Empire, it might just be saying, hey, we have clearance to access the Death Star. We might have clearance into accessing a TIE fighter as an example here. And this is really getting into kind of why session tokens are so important, because they store information about our identity and the things that we provided to prove that we are who we say we are. And so within here, the session token is going to store things like we fulfilled our MFA grant. And the access tokens are something that's also used to grant clearance, maybe in a one-off facet. In the case of Microsoft, it would be saying, hey, we have clearance to go ahead and access Exchange based off of this session token. And that really is providing users a way to access Exchange or email without having to sign in every single time they hit a new page or a new application in that way. And so it's important that we don't just keep disrupting users and make them provide consent every single time they're accessing something. But it's also important that we understand that these access tokens are very powerful in the sense of being in the wrong hands. And that's really what leads into this type of attack that we're going to see with token theft. So as we look at the token theft concept here and we take a look at how this could be involved, we take a look at the rebellion, and just like a hacker out there, they may want to start some type of malicious campaign in email where they're sending some type of malicious attachment or link in an email that this stormtrooper would click on, and effectively here it's going to download malware that is going to be installed on that user's device. In most cases, this is actually going to be one of their personal devices, because a lot of the corporate devices that we manage, have are corporate protections like endpoint protection responses, AV, our RMM software for configuring, security settings on that device. And so in this case, we have malware installed, and with that malware, the attacker in this case can remotely grab the session tokens off of that device, or in some cases you also see them grab the cookies and the session cookies from the browsers like Chrome as an example, and then they'll be able to do and perform what's known as a token replay, where they're effectively just putting those session tokens into their own browser or on their own system, on their own device, and they're able to just pass through and sign into corporate resources, your corporate resources, right? So they're not being prompted to put in any credentials, not being prompted for MFA, but they're basically impersonating or copying your token. Another example that Microsoft used as part of this, in the sense of kind of depicting this, was this theme park example. And so let's say you're going to Disney World and you are going to get a season pass, and that's where you're going to the ticketing office here. Ticketing office would be your identity provider, and they're providing you this season pass. And then you're using the season pass to get access into the rides that you're on as part of that. And the token theft concept is basically like, think of your season pass as a ticket. The attacker in this case pickpockets you, they take your ticket, they make a copy of it, and then they use that to go ride all the rides and act as if they're you in that case. And so you don't really have anything that goes on from just the high level alerts besides what we're going to talk about here, because it's acting and impersonating the user who was compromised in this particular case. And in the example of the theme park, they're getting access to all those rides. And in this case, Baby Yoda here is getting access into, the Empire resources such as the Death Star, and just using that token to basically get in across the board. So when we talk about that, and we talk about what happens afterwards, they've granted access into the account. Depending on the user that they've compromised, that's where we get into other parts of the attack chain, where they might want to conduct some type of persistence mechanism by adding another device, joining an application that allows them API access into the environment. They might start sending off emails to try to move laterally throughout the organization. They may set up inbox rules for data exfiltration. They may go into files that are sensitive and download them locally. That could relate into some type of IP or compromise of very sensitive data. So there's a lot of things they might do after they get through this step. But the main thing is they've bypassed MFA if you've had it set up, and they did so, in this case, this example with, installing malware on a device. In some cases, if that doesn't happen, another way they might do that is through what's known as the adversary in the middle attack, where you may have a managed device, that the user is on, as in, in this case, our Stormtrooper here, but they're able to basically set up a fake website that looks like Microsoft, or in this case might look like the Empire sign-in website. And then they're able to go in and actually harvest the username, password, and an MFA token, and be able to sign in, on their device as well too. And that's another just form of this. I don't want to pigeonhole this into just having personal devices is really the culprit here. It could come from multiple different types of attack where they actually perform this, token theft, if you will, at the end of the day. And so from here, when we talk about token protections, this is where I'm going to get into kind of some of the things that you can do to help prevent against this and go through the policy configurations. If we go back to that same example here, really this is where fundamentally, I always believe in defense in depth, meaning you can do more than just conditional access to help prevent against this. There's layers to that experience that you see here that you could begin to help prevent against, like instituting, phishing resistant MFA. If it's an adversary in the middle attack, that would prevent that. If it's a malicious link, you could be instituting Defender for Office 365 for safe links and safe attachments that might help prevent against that malicious link being even detonated, because they detonate that in a sandbox. And that can go on and on. You have your EDR protections, right? That would prevent malware from being installed on the device locally. There's a lot of things that you can do here, but I specifically want to focus on the identity side today and conditional access. And I've broken these out into licensing considerations. It's unfortunate, I would say today, that these are in P2, just because for SMB, my audience here, this is something that's a little bit more cost prohibitive for the advanced protections that you do get. So I'll go through that here, but if we double click here into the first two, we're talking about enforcing device compliance. And this is really just saying that I'm only going to allow access on devices that meet my corporate standards, such as having AV, being enrolled into by RMM, being enrolled into Intune, and having the necessary protections that make them quote unquote healthy or compliant, right? And so this is technically using an integration with Intune in order to be able to facilitate that. But let's go ahead and configure this device policy in Entra. Real quick, guys, a short break for our sponsor, CloudCapsule here, which is an application that I built to help you monitor your security within your Microsoft 365 tenant that is mapped to the CIS controls. This is something that you could leverage to perform security audits across your customers or your individual Microsoft 365 tenants, map it to CIS, and begin to have steps in mind to go perform a compliance uplift within these customer environments, as well as derive certain project revenue from them as well too. So if you haven't already, definitely check it out. You go to cloudcapsule.io and run a free assessment today to see what it's all about. Okay, so within Entra here, if you go under protection and then conditional access, we're going to set up a new conditional access policy. And the prerequisites, like I mentioned to this, is that you're using Microsoft Intune as your MDM provider. I'll show you an alternative where you don't need to do that. And you can just say it's either, an Entra joined or Entra registered device, which could also work as well. But let's just call this token theft 100. You would scope this to all of the users in your organization, and then you would exclude maybe some break glass users from this so you don't get locked out, especially with this policy because it's very important. Devices could fall out of compliance, and you want to make sure you don't lock yourself out completely. For the targeted resources, you would also set this, to all cloud apps. If you wanted to go lighter weight, you could do selected apps and maybe do the most important ones like protecting Exchange or SharePoint as examples of that, to be able to prevent users from accessing those on non-compliant devices. But maybe they could access, one or the other 365 applications outside of that. That limits you, in certain senses, but that's a big consideration. Networking we're going to go to in the next section there, so I don't need to necessarily configure that for this one. But then in the grant controls, you're going to require the device to be marked as compliant. And within here, you could also say that it is needing to be hybrid joined. If you're running still a hybrid Active Directory environment, that could be another way to say that it's a managed device. But this would basically, again, start shutting down that token theft or token replay, because it would check back into your session, basically see the device that they're trying to use that session token is not compliant, not a managed device, and it would basically shut down that token or that session for them, and they wouldn't be able to access corporate resources. So really, this is the most blanketed way, I think, to be able to perform this type of protection. It's something very hard to get to because you're asking all the users in the organization to have a managed device and have it compliant to get access to anything that they do day to day. And for many of us that have moved into a remote and hybrid workforce, that's a little bit harder to do. The other setting that I wanted to show you here as more of a lightweight way to deploy this is going into the conditions here, and then you can filter for devices as an option. And in this case, what we'd be doing here is we're going to configure this, and we're going to be choosing a property, and we're going to say the trust type equals Entra joined. You could also just say that the trust type equals registered. You could do both and just say or here. And this creates this dynamic query. And fundamentally, what we'd be doing, instead of a grant control for the latter half here, we would be blocking access. So back to this, actually, I think I performed this just a little bit backwards. We're going to say exclude filter devices, right? So we're saying if you're not on an Entra joined device or Entra registered device, I'm going to block your access. And that's the other way that you can do this without actually needing to have these devices enrolled in Intune and subsequently have them as compliant as well. So that's one way that we can do this. And again, very hard to achieve, I think, in a lot of cases, but provides you some of the most blanketed protections and still supports a hybrid workforce that maybe necessarily isn't going to an office or VPNing into a trusted network every day, which is what we're going to see next. So this next one we have here, we're going to use a trusted location with continuous access evaluations, known as CAE. But this is something that's on now by default within conditional access and just users signing in. And it's basically saying, hey, every time we get a new session token, or we periodically are peering in for activity to see if the session itself has changed in any way that might be malicious. And something to indicate that might be that they're signing in from a Tor browser, some malicious IP, or they changed country drastically, in a few minutes, something like that, that would tie back into something changing that would reprompt for credentials and just say, hey, we noticed something changed. We need to have you sign in again and reprompt for things. But on top of that, we can use this strict location continuous access evaluation so that when we're checking, we're really limiting, the IP or location that a user could be signing in from as well. And with that, again, this is harder to do given the hybrid workforce that we live in today, but you have a couple different considerations there when we talk about a hybrid or a trusted network. It could just be, that we're talking about corporate office, right? We have our corporate network. People are going into the office. They're physically there and they're signing in. We have the concept of using a virtual network that people VPN into as part of that. We have the concept of more of a SASE solution. Microsoft calls it the Secure Edge, or SSE, with global secure access within there. And that's more of a cloud-based modern age VPN, if you will, for accessing kind of a private network for basically delivering kind of an isolated system. And then you could also use something like an AVD or a WVD type of infrastructure to say that you can access corporate resources, but you have to be within this boundary. So even if you're on a personal device, you could log into AVD and be able to access corporate resources. So when we talk about this in the sense of the conditional access policy, let's pivot back so I can show you that. Okay, so before we create a new policy here, we're going to create a named location if you haven't done that already. You have country's location, which I always recommend for geo-blocking, but then you have this IP ranges location as well too. I'm not going to get into global secure access because that's well beyond the scope of this video, but basically you could have and set up, IP ranges. In this case, I've set up kind of my home network here for my internal access, and I can gate access based off of this IP range. But whenever you have that and you go into your policy here, if I go back here and I click on new policy, we can call this token def 101. Same thing here, you would scope this to all users, exclude some break glass accounts. For the targeted resource, again, you could target all cloud applications or select applications, depending on if you needed to scope that down at first. Within the network section here, you can configure this and you can say selected networks and locations. In this case, I could choose my internal location here. And then under the grant controls, I would go ahead and grant access and require multi-factor authentication here. But then also in this session, what I would want to do is click on Customize Continuous Access Evaluation and click on the Strictly Enforce Location Policies. And so basically, if we're not in this allowed range here for the network and, we're saying that we're applying that here, it's going to reprompt them for credentials. So in this case, even if somebody got compromised with an adversary in the middle attack, or they got the token replay because somebody harvested some of the tokens from the device itself, the primary refresh token, something like that. This is another one that you can configure with P1 licensing here to be able to select from. And again, if you have a VPN, if you have virtual private network set up, or if you have IP ranges, you can list in there as far as the physical Wi-Fi, things like that. Those are all things you can do as part of that policy. The next two here are more premium level features because they are included in P2. But one of the things they've come out with preview here is this device bound concept, meaning whenever we have our devices that are joined into Entra or registered to Entra, we have this concept of token binding with the device itself. And that's related to the primary refresh token that's on that particular device bound into our sessions. And we can actually enforce that that device is present. It's tied to that session whenever we are granting access. And if it doesn't meet that, we can actually block that. That setting back in Entra here is under the session section. And in this particular case, instead of the customized continuous access evaluation, we would be looking at this required token protection for sign-in sessions. And as you'll see here, this is both for session cookie and a refresh token to be bound to the device using the software key binding or hardware security module binding where applicable. And so this is actually grayed out for me because today, at the time of this recording, it's only available in this preview mode for select applications, and specifically those applications are Exchange and SharePoint. So if we go in and we select those here, so again, Exchange and SharePoint, select that here from the dropdown. And if I go back to my session controls, this is ungrayed out now. So now we can select it. And this is, again, a much more superior offering, I think, than even the customized continuous access evaluation, because it's bound, it's binding that token to our actual physical device. And this would allow you to kind of have that protection without needing users to be on a specific IP range, which is much more restrictive and I think much harder to do for the average business that we have out there. So that's just another one there. But again, this does require P2 and there's some more limitations. I'll link to it in my blog post as part of that because of the fact that it's in preview right now. Within Entra though, you can actually see these activity records. If I go into the monitoring and health, and I go into the sign-in logs. Within these sign-in logs, if I click on one here, I can actually see within the basic info, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll be able to see token protection sign-in session, and it's got none for this particular sign-in. But if I look at a different one, this is saying unbound. So I don't have one for that particular sign-in. And let me find one that does. So this one shows unbound, and you would have bound there if it was applicable for that, and that's what would help with the evaluation in that token theft attack. As soon as this attacker here is trying to perform this token replay, it would recognize that it's not bound to their device, and it would prevent them from accessing it further. So that's another one here. And then the last one here is more related to the risk detections that are a little bit more heightened with P2 that you get as part of that with the continuous access evaluation. It's really much more advanced, I would say, than P1 in the sense of the telemetry that you get in the analytics that they're trying to pull, which is also why it's a bummer as part of that. But these are other ones that you can leverage here, and that would look for things like anonymous sign in from an infrequent location, sign in from impossible travel, meaning the user typically signs out of Philadelphia, and then all of a sudden 3 minutes later they signed in from Japan, as an example. And that's something that could then shut down the session either through conditional access or continuous access evaluation or through some of the risk detections. So let's see that back in the Entra portal. If we go back into conditional access here, we go back into our policies, create a new policy. And in this one, you'd be targeting the users again here, and you would be targeting the applications. In the conditions section though, you would be filtering in for risk, right? And so you could target either user risk or sign-in risk. I typically make these two separate policies so I know which one's triggering. And this and sign-in risk could also relate to sign-in sessions from a service account. So I think it's highly important to have that as well too as a separate one. But you could say, if the risk here is medium or high, then you're going to perform some action. And in most cases, what I do is I go ahead and either block the account or I require a password reset. And that's Microsoft's recommendation for those policies. For this is to require this password change whenever they're high risk, something like that. The caveat, if you just said instead of a grant that this is just block access, if they're medium to high risk and you investigate, there's a higher chance of frustration. Or somebody going overseas to travel on vacation, as an example, and can't sign in to get their email. And maybe that's the CEO and he's in there for a board meeting. That really turns into an angry conversation that they have with you. So you just have to be careful with that. But effectively, we do want to have some type of activity that happens whenever high elevated risk is taken that makes us, go in and perform some type of change with the account. In this case, if they're asked to reset their password, they'll have to put in their current password as part of that. And if they're just replaying a session token, they're not going to know what that is. So that's kind of the thesis behind that, and being able to shut this down from that level as well too. Okay guys, that's everything I have for you today. Hope this was helpful in understanding more about token replay attacks and how you can prevent them. Definitely comment below with any questions you guys have or what you're doing today to help prevent against this type of attack. As always, stay vigilant, and I'll see you guys next week.